Our world is getting smaller every day. The human species is now more connected than since man first started to walk upright, and yet we still find ourselves divided. Imagine living in a village of 100 people 2,000 years ago. Could you have ever imagined just how far your future offspring would travel to achieve a better life? Today we're going to look at historical human migration patterns and how they've affected every continent on Earth, and what it would look like if there was a reversal of this latest period of mass migration. That is, what if everyone on Earth went back to their country of origin, as a sort of hypothetical thought experiment. Yeah, I know technically all human beings originated from just one spot on the planet and then spread out all over the world, and that philosophically speaking, no one's native to anywhere, but I'm just going to be including the most commonly accepted definitions for someone's country of origin rather than playing this game of semantics. Let's go ahead and start with the region that has been the most heavily impacted by immigration, which of course would be the Americas, both north and south. It wasn't until the European age of exploration that the Americas had their demographics permanently altered through the initial migration of European settlers and African slaves, and later on through immigrants from both Europe, Africa, and Asia, making the continents the most racially diverse in the world. Now, in the original video I made over this topic, I was really torn over what to do with those of heritage from multiple nations. And considering that the majority of the people in the Americas today are multi-ethnic or multiracial, it does make this thought experiment quite a bit more complicated. I decided that people of multiple ancestries would simply be broken up into their components, if that makes sense. For instance, seeing how I'm part German, Iranian, and black, about 50% of me would go to Europe, 25% to the Middle East, and 25% to Africa. And yes, obviously I would die, but again, semantics. This is just a thought experiment. Although only around 5% of North America and South America's population are of pure Native American descent, millions more may have partial Amerindian genes, such as the mestizos of Hispanic America or the pardos of Brazil, and even more that identify as white or black today also have a small amount of Native American admixture. So although the continents of North and South America would take a considerable hit, with hundreds of millions of people leaving to Europe, Africa, and Asia, about 19% of the population, or 195 million out of a billion people, would be left behind, seeing how around 19% of the genome of the population of North and South America is of Native American descent. Looking at the borders of American countries now, the area where the exodus would have the greatest impact would without a doubt be the United States, which would only have around 5 million people afterwards, not taking the recent influx of Amerindians from Latin America into account. The largest country in the Americas after this purge would actually be Mexico at 45 million people, seeing around 15% of the country is of Amerindian descent and another 60 to 70% is of mestizo origin, meaning that around 40% of the country's genome is Amerindian. This would be followed by Brazil at 25 million, since although it may not have a particularly large native contribution at around 12%, it already has the second largest population in the Americas. Most of Latin America would have a huge chunk of its population ripped away, but as you can see from this map, all Latin American countries have a medium to large contribution of native admixture, at least when compared to the United States and Canada, whose countries would become the most sparsely populated regions in the world. Well, where would all these folks be headed to? Well, all over the world, with around 100 million going to Africa, 40 million to Asia, 20 million to the Middle East, although the largest share by far would be going back to Europe. And this continent is where we would see some of the most dramatic cases of population boosts after our so-called mass global repatriation. By taking all the descendants of European immigrants in areas outside of Europe, and by taking the European component of mixed-race populations such as the mestizos, mulattoes, and pardos of Latin America, this would effectively double the continent's population from 700 million to 1.4 billion, although we have to also take into account that there are around 40 to 50 million non-Europeans in Europe at the moment. The nations of Ireland, Scotland, England, Wales, Cornwall, Spain, Portugal, Norway, Albania, and Italy all have more people of their nationality living outside of their nation than in it, and hence after repatriation, their populations would more than double, with some growing at truly outrageous proportions. One of the main reasons that there's such a surplus for these particular ethnic groups is because hundreds of years ago, when their ancestors first left the continent of Europe to escape to the New World, it was typical for families living in frontier regions to have far more children than those living in the relatively cramped cities of Europe, which generally had more crime, disease, and poverty, which made it much harder to have large families. Countries like the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand would contribute to the large influx of people into Great Britain and other Germanic nations, while the Latino nations of the Americas would contribute to the influx into Spain, Portugal, and other Italic nations. The biggest impact in Europe would definitely be in the West, as historically there was a much higher emigration rate among Western Europeans to the New World than Eastern Europeans, as can be seen by this map, which shows the percentage increase a nation would receive after repatriation. For instance, England would receive 76 million additional people of English descent when compared to the 54 million people that already lived there, leading to a net increase of 140%. Some of the most dramatic examples of new population increase would be the island of Ireland, whose population would increase by over 600%, from 6.6 million to 48 million, meaning 6 times as many people of Irish descent live outside of Ireland than in it. Similarly striking numbers can be seen for the other Celtic nations of the British Isles, such as Scotland at 250% and Wales at 115%. Nations like Germany and Italy would also receive a huge influx from not only the United States, but even Latin America. Or especially Latin America, seeing how Brazil and Argentina have huge Italian communities. However, Portugal would take the prize for the highest growth proportion-wise, since when including the Portuguese component of the 90 million Brazilian pardos, this would increase Portugal's population from 10 to 87 million, even one of the highest population densities in the world, and I honestly don't know if it's logistically possible to have so many tens of millions of people in such a small space. It essentially turned the entire country into one huge city. The new largest nations in Europe would be the Spanish at a staggering 273 million, the Russians at 154 million, the Germans at 151 million, the Italians at 139 million, and the English at 130 million, which would certainly make Europe a lot more crowded. An area of the world that would also be heavily impacted would be the continent of Africa to the south, whose population was greatly affected by the American slave trade, along with the recent migration of sub-Saharan Africans to the Americas and North Africans into Europe. The overwhelming majority of the estimated 100 million Africans in the Americas would be going either to West or Central Africa, seeing how that's where the majority of the slaves were taken from, with Nigeria experiencing the largest overall increase in population, mostly through the Igbo and Yoruba peoples. The Maghrebi nations of Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya all have over 10% of their nation's population living outside of the continent of Africa, mostly in Europe, so they would also receive a large boost in population. I realize that a lot of people would argue that North African Arabs are not technically native to the region, but the majority of the genes of the people of the Maghreb were not significantly altered by the Arab invasions from the Middle East, and speaking of which, the Middle East would also receive a huge boost from repatriation, especially the Levant, with the largest communities of people of Lebanese, Syrian, and Palestinian descent all being located in Latin America. Consequently, as a result of repatriation, because most of these early Arab immigrants were Christians, after this movement, Lebanon would become a Christian nation once again, gaining over 8 million people, nearly tripling the population of the already small nation. And additionally, Palestine and Syria would also gain a large number of Christians from millions of the Assyrians and Arabic-speaking Christians that migrated to the Americas in the past. However, because the Gulf countries have such a huge number of immigrants, they would lose a large chunk of their population to South Asia, which would gain a large number from repatriations around the world. However, because of their already astronomically large populations, it wouldn't affect the proportions as much as the other regions. The areas of South Asia that have been most heavily affected by emigration have mostly been on the coast or in the south, with there being almost 59 million people of South Asian descent outside of the region of South Asia, scattered throughout the world, but mostly in the neighboring Middle East, Southeast Asia, or the quickly growing South Asian communities in the United States. There are around 5.8 million Bengalis outside of South Asia, giving them the largest diaspora population, although they're closely followed by the Tamils, which, when including migrants from both Tamil Nadu and Tamil Eelam in Sri Lanka, they number around 5.6 million worldwide, giving the region of Tamil Eelam the highest rate of repatriation for any South Asian region, followed by Gujarat, Nepal, and Kerala. East Asia is similar to South Asia as it has an absolutely monumental population, although there are still large diasporas of East Asians around the globe, but especially the neighboring region of Southeast Asia. The nation of Korea would increase by over 7 million ethnic Koreans from around the globe, and Japan would increase by over 4 million, and around 85 million ethnic Han Chinese would be repatriated from outside the People's Republic of China, mostly from Taiwan, the Americas, and Southeast Asia, especially Singapore, which has a Chinese majority. Speaking of Southeast Asia, because so many people in Thailand, the Philippines, and Malaysia have full or partial Chinese ancestry, they would lose a large chunk of their populations. However, when taking recent global diasporas into account, the Philippines would gain around 5 million people, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Thailand all around 2 million each, and it can be debated whether the Malagasy people can be considered native to the island of Madagascar or whether they would be repatriated back to Southeast Asia because around half their genome is of Southeast Asian descent from around 1300 years ago, with the other half being from Bantus from Southeast Africa. Global migration has always been a really fascinating subject for me, seeing how just about everyone you'll meet here in the United States has had their ancestors migrate from somewhere else in the recent past. And although it's certainly interesting to look at a world without immigration and see just how much it's altered the planet, anyone out there can take pride in their national or ethnic origin, so never stop learning about other people's countries and cultures. And to close, I'll leave you with a poem by Cletus Ali. If they send in Indians to India, and Africans back to Africa, well, somebody please just tell me, where they send in poor me. I am neither one nor the other, 6 of one, half a dozen of the other. So if they send in all these people back home for true, they got to split me in two. Thanks for watching, everyone. It has been Mason, and I'll see you next time.
Just like you always